If you take a photo of me, do not put it in Facebook. Facebook is a monstrous surveillance engine. It does surveillance of its users, it does surveillance of its non-users, and if you put a photo of someone in Facebook, Facebook uses that as one more way to do surveillance of that person. We could dispute whether putting photos of your friends in Facebook is decent treatment of a friend, but that doesn't directly affect me. Putting photos of me in Facebook does affect me. Please don't do that. Of course, if you're wise, you won't use Facebook at all. Second, if you make a recording of this talk and you want to distribute copies, please only in the formats that are favorable to free software, which means the OGG formats or WebM, not in MP anything, not in Flash, not in Real Player, Windows Media Player, or QuickTime. Those formats are all bad for free software. And second, put on the Creative Commons No Derivatives license, because this is a statement of my personal views. So, you'll see many activities that say their goal is digital inclusion or digital literacy. Well, is that really a good thing to work for? Is it good to participate in a digital society, or is it bad? Well, that depends. It depends on whether the digital society is set up in a way that respects people's freedom. If it respects people's freedom, then yes, it's good to be included. If it tramples your freedom, what you need is to be extracted. We need to work for digital extraction, escape from the digital society. Unfortunately, our freedom is threatened in many ways in the digital society, and that's what I'm going to talk about. 9 different threats to our freedom in the digital society. First, there is surveillance. Now, corporations do surveillance and states do surveillance, but in both cases they do it because digital technology facilitates surveillance. Digital technology makes possible a level of surveillance that Stalin could only dream of. And when the corporations do surveillance, they use that to annoy people. But they also make the data available to the state. So really, corporate surveillance is a branch of the more dangerous state surveillance. After all, the advertisements might annoy you, perhaps, but if you get arrested because you're suspected of being a dissident, that can do a lot worse. So surveillance is done by a lot of websites, you'll find. They're collecting a lot of information and sending it to many companies. Just by visiting a web page, many companies may be informed that you visited it. Now this is very important because the European Union is now considering how to update its data protection rules, which were designed for the time when a company had data about you because you wrote it on a form and mailed it in. So the company would have someone type this into the company's own computer, and that's where it was. The rules don't consider the possibility that just by looking at the sign of the company, various other companies have been told that you're there. Like maybe Facebook, if there's a like button in that page, Facebook knows your computer visited that page because the image of the like button comes from a Facebook server. So the Facebook server knows which machine is visiting the page, and it knows which page it sent the like button image for. So it's already collected personal data about you. So things have to be done, the data protection has to be, basically should prohibit that kind of thing. it should say to a company that runs the web page, you can't set up your web page to tell anybody else about your visitors. Illegal. Now, often, as in this case, surveillance is done through the programs running on our own computers, like the browser, for instance. When it's done that way, we can prevent it if the program is free software, because we can change it not to do the surveillance. Surveillance features are common in proprietary programs. We know about specific surveillance functionalities in Microsoft Windows, in the iThings, in Flash Player, in Angry Birds. Angry Birds is spyware. In the Amazon Swindle, not its official name, and in nearly all portable phones. Well, when the surveillance is done through your own computer, if the software in the computer is free, in general you can turn off the surveillance by changing the software, and the users would do that. They would make versions that don't surveil you and use those. But surveillance is also done through systems at one remove from the user. For instance, ISPs and phone companies, which save information. In fact, European countries require them to save information to build up a dossier about each user. And since we don't own the companies in the computers of the ISP or the phone company, we can't directly stop it from saving this information. That can only be done through political action. Now, somebody in Germany asked the phone company for a list of all his location information. Because they don't just save who you talk to, they also save location information. So he had to go to court to get it. The phone company wanted to protect his privacy by not telling him its information about him. But eventually he succeeded in forcing the phone company to hand it over. And it gave him 35,000 locations for a period of 6 months, which is around 200 locations a day, which is several times an hour. And you could figure out most of a person's life from that data. Somebody else used a provision in Irish law to make Facebook give him all the data it had about him. I believe he got thousands of pages. He lived in the former East Germany, I believe, and he said that the Stasi wouldn't have had that much data about a person who was not politically interested. But Facebook does. In any case, sometimes surveillance is done through systems that exist only for surveillance and have nothing to do with our own computers. Now, this could be drones flying over the city, face recognition cameras, whatever. They're doing all sorts of things. In some cities in the US, they're putting microphones into city buses to listen to people's conversations. And since those microphones connect to the internet, probably other unauthorized people can listen to them too. In England, there are cameras by the side of the road that recognize car license plates, and they're everywhere, so they track all car traffic. They build up records of where every car went for a long time in the past, and save it as a dossier about everyone. They can also track a car in real time. This is worse surveillance than the Soviet Union was ever able to set up. And it's a big threat to our freedom. Of course, they come up with excuses, and some of those excuses are real annoyances or even real dangers, but they're small compared with the danger of is surveillance. The state is far more powerful than any illegal organization. It can do far more damage to people if it gets out of check. So, when the state does massive surveillance, it uses that to attack democracy. And democracy is what we need to stop the state from hurting us. So this is extremely dangerous. The tracking of cars in England has already been used to sabotage democracy. People believed to be protesters on their way to a demonstration were tracked and intercepted and blocked by police so that they couldn't go to the protest. This is the big danger. The next threat is censorship. Censorship, of course, is not new. But 15 years ago, it looked like the internet might strike a blow against censorship. It might be too hard to censor the internet, and governments would just give up. Well, now we know that a state can censor the internet if it works hard enough. And we find that many states now censor the internet, and not just obvious tyrannies like China and Iran. Of course, they do horrible things in every area of life. Why wouldn't they do a horrible thing in the internet? What else is new? But no, countries that claim to be free are also censoring the internet, such as Denmark. Denmark, many years ago, imposed filters on access to foreign websites, blocking a long list of pages which was secret. The victims of censorship were not supposed to be able to know what they were being blocked from seeing. Then they would be able to think about whether it's a bad thing. They weren't supposed to think about being censored. But someone leaked a copy of this list and it was posted in WikiLeaks. Whereupon they blocked access to that page of WikiLeaks. Meaning, basically, people everyone in the world could see what was blocked in Denmark except the victims. Well, this kind of thing is quite common. About 4 years ago, the government of Turkey told all internet users there that they could choose between censorship and more censorship, and more censorship, and even more censorship. 4 different levels of censorship, but access to the real internet would not be possible. There were protests in the street, but the government didn't change its plan. Of course, that's not the only censorship in Turkey. They imprison a lot of journalists also. In Australia, they don't have filters. There was an attempt, but it was defeated politically. However, Australia has another kind of censorship of links. A link to a banned site is very heavily punished. Electronic Frontier Australia put a link to a foreign political website and was ordered to delete the link on pain of a fine of $11,000 a day. Now, what was this foreign political website? It was anti-abortion. Well, I think that that's completely wrong. Women should be able to get abortions for whatever reason. But even though I'm against their views, I defend their right to present those views, and censoring is an attack on people's freedom. In India, which says it's a democracy, censorship is rampant. Websites are closed without even a trial because someone in the government thinks they might offend somebody. Now, the freedom to offend people is an essential part of freedom of speech. But in India, you don't really have freedom of speech. Now, websites can also be disconnected without a trial in France and in Spain. Filtering has been imposed in various ways in the UK, in Italy. Censorship is spreading across Europe. Now, there's always some excuse, like something you might find disgusting or you'd be horrified anyone would think such a thing. Those are not grounds to censor anyone. No matter how disgusting a work might be, censorship is more disgusting. Now, we know that some of those excuses for censorship were really meant as excuses. A representative of the IFPI, which is an international organization of record companies, said at a conference that he was very excited by the idea of censoring so-called child pornography, because once the filters were in place, they could block the things they really wanted to block, which was sharing. So it's not just a suspicion that it's an excuse meant to be the edge of the wedge. It's admitted. But in recent years, they've become bolder. Now they don't offer excuses. They say they want to impose the censorship filters to stop people from sharing, which is an evil goal in itself. Well, that's another issue. The next threat to our freedom comes from data formats that restrict the users. For instance, some of them are secret. When users are restricted by a secret format, we call that digital handcuffs or digital restrictions management, DRM. Many applications save the user's data in a secret format. Why? Typically this happens when the developer of that, first of all, it's always a proprietary program. If the software is free, the format is not secret, because the source code shows what the format is. So the secret formats are only found in proprietary user-subjugating software. But the reason that they make the format, that they keep the format secret, is they think that their program dominates the market. And they figure that if they prevent the possibility of interoperation, it will be impossible for a competitor to get started. So basically, using those programs is falling very directly into a trap that if you use it, your data is in a secret format and you can't use your own data. Secret formats are also used for data that's published. For instance, many distributors of videos and music and books on the internet use secret formats to restrict people. We know of specific digital handcuffs in Microsoft Windows, in Mac OS, in the iThings, in Flash Player, in the PlayStation 3, in the Amazon Swindle. So it's a very common attack on users' rights. Now, Flash has a digital handcuff feature. But the rest of the Flash format is not a secret. However, it restricts users because they've changed it so frequently that the free world hasn't been able to catch up. It's not supported. Recent versions of Flash are not supported by any free software. So distributing anything in a way that makes users use Flash is pushing them to use non-free software. This is one reason why you shouldn't post things in YouTube. You have a video you want to distribute, put it on your own site. And if you're afraid that there will be too much traffic and it will be bad for your site, make a torrent. And tell people, here's the torrent, get my video through this. Now, another way a format can restrict people is if it's patented. This is why it's bad to use the MP formats, because they're all patented. And the result of this is that even though free software exists to support those formats, many distributors of free software are afraid to distribute that free software, afraid of getting sued if they do. And this means that many gnu/linux distributions do not come with free software to handle those formats. So what do they have? Well, they may have nothing at all for those formats, and that's bad, because when users get those distros, they think gnu/linux can't handle this format. It's no good. Or these distros may come with proprietary programs for those formats, which is evil. It's leading people not to have freedom. So why is this a problem? It's a problem because those formats are used. So what must we do? We must not distribute in those formats. To avoid contributing to the problem, we must not make files in those formats. So I never do, and that's why I give those instructions to people recording my talk. Don't make files in those formats whose use constitutes a problem for our community. The next threat to our freedom in the digital society comes from non-free software. Now, when I say free software, I'm talking about freedom, not price. So think of free speech, not free beer. So it's volume. It's not, how do you say zero price in Polish? What? You, please loud. Volny is also zero price? No, how do you say zero price?
So we have distinguished.
Could you please say it loud? I know. I can't hear two people at once. I'm sorry. I'm hard of hearing it. Two people speak. I can't hear anything. It's just it's useless. It doesn't work, and I can't do anything about it either. Anyway, in many countries, you see people love to use English words, so they're talking in their own language about free software, and they say free software, which basically means making it ambiguous. Use your word. It's better. In fact, in speaking English, we'll often use the French or Spanish word libre or libre. They're written the same. Just to make it clear, we're talking about freedom. With software, you see, there are just two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. The first case is free software, because the users have control of the program if they have certain essential freedoms. Those freedoms give the users control effectively over the program. There are 4 essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code and change it to make the program do your computing as you wish. Freedom 2 is the freedom to redistribute exact copies when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions when you wish. Now, the first 2 freedoms, to run it as you wish and change it and use your modified version, they give users individual control of the program. Because with these freedoms, you can make the program do what you want it to do and then do it. But individual control is not enough, because most users don't know how to program. If you give them individual control and nothing more, they're still stuck. So we need collective control, which means that any group of users can work together to make their version of the program do what they've decided. And that way, the users that don't know how to program still get the benefit of control because they participate in a group with other people that want similar things. And some of the people in the group are programmers, they do the actual work, but the other users in this group get what they want. And of course, the group doesn't have to be private, the group can publish, and usually does publish their version using Freedom 3, and then everybody can use that version if that's what they like. So with free software, the users control the program, but if the users don't have these freedoms, then they don't really control the program, which means the program controls the users. And the owner controls the program. So through the program's owner exercises power over the program's users. Thus, a non-free program is an instrument of unjust power. This is why non-free software is bad, why it's an injustice, why it should not exist. To develop non-free software is to harm society. You should never do that. And if somebody else does that, you should be wise enough not to let it hurt you by not using that non-free software. You've got to escape. So that's the idea of the free software movement. That's why I started developing the GNU operating system in 1984, to make a place to escape to. A place where you can live in freedom and use computers. I don't mean a physical place, I mean a place in cyberspace. But the point is, it's a place where we could be free, the free world. Now, the owner of a non-free program is typically a corporation, which means by structure a psychopath. So when you give that psychopath power over some users, what's it going to do? It's going to abuse that power. It's going to take advantage of that power to push the users down even more and gain more out by squeezing it out of them or hurting them somehow. That's why you find malicious functionalities in so many widely used non-free programs. Because those non-free programs to their owners are opportunities to abuse the users. That's what they're for. I expect that the developers nowadays plan how they're going to abuse the users, and then they think about how to get people to use the thing. So, if you use a non-free program, you're not only giving up your freedom, but you're basically putting on a kick me sign. But with free software, the developers don't have power. Nobody has power over anybody through a free program. So they don't feel the same temptation. They know that if the developers know that if one of them were to put in a malicious functionality, the others would see it and sooner or later would take it out. Meaning that they know that they can't impose bad things on the users, and therefore they don't feel the same kind of temptation. And this is the only known defense against malicious functionalities in software, for the software to be free. It's not a perfect defense. There are free programs and systems that have some surveillance features. The users can and do make modified versions that don't have it. So the point is, it's not a perfect defense. defense. It's not guaranteed, none is known. But it is a defense, and that's a lot better than being a defenseless user of non-free software. Would someone like to get me some water? It's very hot in here.
Perhaps some Pepsi?
Well, actually, water would be best. But also, if there's any way to open a window, let in a bit of cool air. It's a sort of old building, so it's not fascist. Is there, so I don't have to drink it out of the bottle, is there a glass? Oh well. See, if I drink it out of the bottle, no one else should have any, and that's not ideal use. Wait, oh, this is soda. But it seems to have gas in it. I won't want any of this, thank you, but take it back because I don't like soda without sugar. Oh well. Now, I've mentioned two kinds of malicious functionality so far. There are the surveillance functionalities called spyware, and there are the restriction functionalities called digital handcuffs or digital restrictions management. There's a third kind, a backdoor. A backdoor receives commands from somewhere to do something to the user, without asking permission, usually without even telling the user that something is being done. We know about backdoors in Microsoft Windows, in the iThings, in the Amazon Swindle, and in nearly all portable phones. The one in portable phones is a universal backdoor, meaning it permits remote imposition of software changes. Microsoft Windows also has a universal backdoor, permitting remote imposition of software changes. What that means is those programs are not just malware, they are universal malware. Any malicious functionality that's not in Windows now could be remotely installed tomorrow through the back door. Same for portable phones. In fact, the universal backdoor in portable phones has been used to convert them into listening devices. You've heard of software that has bugs. This software is a bug. So imagine what it means if government agencies are using Windows. That's a threat to national security, as well as denial of the computing sovereignty of the state. The presence of non-free software in any state entity is a grave problem, and that problem needs to be corrected by getting rid of it.
Soda.
Also check to see whether it's a Coca-Cola company, but it's not. Well, Coca-Cola probably owns some Polish water company, because it does in most countries. There's a worldwide boycott of Coca-Cola company for murdering union organizers in Colombia and Guatemala. So look at killercoke.org for more information. So in every country I go to, I find out which brand of water is from Coca-Cola, and I make sure I don't ever use that. software movement in 1983, and I began developing the GNU operating system in 1984. The computer won't do anything without an operating system. So to make free software a real option in life, we needed a free operating system, and it was up to me to make it. Of course, I didn't do it all by myself. I recruited other people to write pieces of the system. Because to have a full operating system, we needed hundreds of components. Although, as time went on, people expected more capability in an operating system, so the number of components we would need grew. It was around 200 in 1984. By 1990, it was more like 1,000, and we had most of it. In 1990, we had almost all of the initial system, but one major essential component was missing. That was the kernel. The kernel is the program that allocates the computer's resources to all the other programs you run. So we hired somebody in 1990 to start developing a kernel. But I chose a design that was too advanced, and it turned into somewhat of a research project. And that kernel, well, it works, but not all that well. Fortunately, we didn't have to wait for it, because in 1992, Mr. Torvalds, who had written a proprietary kernel called Linux, freed it. He re-released it under the GNU General Public License, which is the license I had written to release the programs of GNU. Now, there are many free software licenses. You see, a free software license is a declaration by the copyright holders of the program giving every user the 4 freedoms. There are many ways to do this, so there are many different free software licenses. They're not all equivalent. The basic distinction between categories of free software license is copyleft or not. You see, if you make something free in a very permissive way, if you say, do whatever you like with this code, somebody will get a copy and make some changes and release that as proprietary software. And he would do it because you let him. The problem is that then he would distribute that proprietary software, which is a modified version of your program, to other people, and they wouldn't get any freedom. Well, if your goal is just to please your ego and think lots of people are using my code, boy, that means I'm so good, you might call this success. My goal was to give people freedom, and for that goal, it would have been failure. They would get my code, but they wouldn't get freedom. It would be defeat. So I had to make sure that did not happen. And the method I came up with is copyleft. It's a way of using copyright law to defend freedom for every user for every copy of every version of the code. Copyleft is a kind of condition that you put in a free software license, and it says more or less, whenever you distribute anything that contains some of this code, the entire thing you're distributing has to be released under this license, the same license. So you have to pass along the 4 freedoms with your version the same as we gave them to you. You must respect the freedom of others as we respected your freedom. Which means that the freedom goes with the code everywhere. So the GNU General Public License, or GNU GPL, is the first implementation of copyleft. That's the principal free software license, and that most free software packages use it. But there are other licenses. So you'll find people who think that free software is equivalent to being under the GNU GPL. That's not true. There were always other free software licenses. So anyway, when Torvalds re-released Linux under the GNU GPL, he made it free software. And Linux filled this gap in the GNU system, producing something that was basically the GNU system, but also contained Linux. In other words, the GNU plus Linux system, or GNU/Linux system. I ask you please to call it that when you talk about it. You'll find lots of people call the whole thing Linux, which basically means ignoring the GNU system and pretending that the whole thing is this one piece, which means giving the principal developer none of the credit, which is not nice to us. So please call the system GNU/Linux. Give us equal mention. We did start the whole activity. We provided the goal. We did develop a bigger fraction of the code than any other project, so I think equal mention is a fair thing for us to ask. Now, you will find that some people, when talking about free software, use another term, quote, open source, unquote. The reason is they didn't want to raise the ethical issues, which are the center of the whole issue for us. They don't want to talk about freedom. They don't want to say that non-free programs are an injustice. That's too shocking. Those are people who don't like to criticize any widely used business practice. So they invented another term, which had never been used in the computing field before. So they had the chance to decide which ideas to associate with it and which ideas to leave out. So they left out the entire ethical foundation of the free software movement, and they presented it as purely a practical question. So we say if you develop a program and you distribute copies, you are morally bound to respect the freedom of the people who get those copies, which means release it as free software. And the open source people say if you develop a program and release it, it's in your practical interest to let the users modify and redistribute it because they'll make the code quality better. You see the difference in values? The two arguments argue for the same conclusion, but we say this is a matter of right or wrong, and they say it's a matter of how to get better quality code. So, I'm not a supporter of the open source philosophy. I don't want to be described as an open source anything because that gives people the wrong idea of what I stand for. Where you stand is up to you. But if you agree that this is a matter of freedom, the way you present that is by saying only software and not saying open source. Especially if you're in a discussion where other people are saying open source. It's extremely important for you to be the first one to bring in the issue of freedom. Because once you've done it, somebody else might join you. There might be a few people, all of whom are thinking, well, they're all talking about open source. I don't want to be the one who's different, which is cowardice. But if you show a tiny bit of courage and you talk about freedom, then you might get something started. And that's how you advance the cause of freedom. And that's the most important thing we need to do. You see, our future depends above all on our values. If you give people freedom but they don't appreciate it, they'll throw it away. They'll let it drop because freedom is frequently threatened, and to keep it you have to defend it, and that takes work. It takes moral firmness. It's easier to let your freedom go. Of course, you'll regret it later. Well, one difficulty for defending our freedom in computing is that there hasn't been much debate about what freedom people should have in the virtual world, using computers or programs. And nearly everybody started using using computers with proprietary software. And everyone they knew was using proprietary software. They didn't realize there was any other way it could possibly be. So they took for granted that proprietary software was morally legitimate. Which means, in effect, they allowed the owners of proprietary software to dictate the answer. What human rights do you deserve in using a program? They dictated none. They dictated, we can impose any conditions on you that we want to. And most people accepted that. Well, we in the free software movement say no. We believe we've identified 4 human rights that the user of a program deserves and should always have. Those are the 4 freedoms that define free software. But when we try to bring these ideas to the attention of the general public or the users of the GNU system, we encounter 2 obstacles. First, the users of the GNU system don't know it's the GNU system. They think it's Linux. And they think it comes from the vision of Mr. Torvalds, and he's an open source person. He doesn't agree with us. I wish he would, but he doesn't. So the point is, when the people think our work is his, they admire him for our work, and they follow his ideas for our work. Now that's not the way to defend freedom. So if you call the system gnu+linux, you're helping to inform people of where this software really came from, and thus they'll see why it exists. They'll see that the system is the result of an intentional campaign to give them freedom. And then they may think about the issue. They might listen to the arguments we give for why they should fight for freedom. And some of them will believe it and they'll fight for freedom, and we might win. And the other obstacle is that most of them don't even see the term free software. They see open source, which of course is associated with the ideas of the people who mainly push that term, which are different. They don't talk about it as a matter of freedom. That was their goal, to avoid the issue of freedom. And they did. So when our work is described as open source, the issue of freedom is being covered up. So we need your help in saying free or only and not open source. You know, I regularly see articles that call me the father of open source. When I see them, I send a letter to the editor saying, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived through artificial insemination using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. Then I explain the ideas of the free software movement, which is the real point of this letter. That's what's important, so that people who read that periodical will get to see the ideas of free software, which were clearly missing from the previous article. However, I started with a joke because I like jokes, and I hope that that gets the letter printed. But I can't do all of this. I need your help. If you suggest more things for me to do, well, I can't do any more. I'm working basically full-time and much more on this. So for us to do more, you've got to do it. And if you want to learn to give speeches about free software and freedom, that would be very useful. It's, in fact, the biggest contribution you could make. Anyway, to close this subtopic, I want to explain, first of all, why government agencies, all of them, must use only free software. Because they do their computing for the people, not for their own pleasure. So, if you lose control of your computing, say you're using proprietary software, that's your misfortune. And I will be sorry for you. I will encourage you to switch to free software and recover the control of your computing, but I won't be angry at you. I won't say that you attacked and injured me. Sure, it's bad to encourage non-free software, but primarily you're the victim. However, a government agency does its computing for the people, and if that government agency loses control of its computing It's injuring the people. That's a failure to carry out its responsibility to the people. So this is something that must be corrected. And of course, while each state agency has a purpose, the state as a whole has a purpose too, a mission, which is to organize society for the well-being and freedom of the people. And in the computing field, that means leading people to free software. But the most important activities are education. Educational activities, including all schools, from the kindergarten to the university, must teach exclusively free software. And this is not just to save money. That's a secondary benefit that's often possible. But that's not what's really at stake here. This is not about how to do education a little better. This is about how to do good education instead of bad education. Because teaching a non-free program is implanting dependence. And that goes against the social mission of the school, which is to educate good citizens of a strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free society. In the computing field, that means graduating capable users of free software, ready to live in a free digital society. Why is it that many proprietary developers offer gratis copies of their non-free software to schools? It's because they want to use those schools to implant dependence in society. The idea is that the school receives the gratis copies, teaches the students to use them, and they become dependent, and then they graduate, and they're still dependent. And after they graduate, the developer does not offer those ex-students gratis copies. Oh no. And some of them go to work for companies. The developer doesn't offer those companies gratis copies. Oh no. It's just like offering schools gratis needles full of addictive drugs, saying the first dose is gratis. The school would reject the drugs, gratis or no, and it should reject the proprietary software, gratis or no, in order to carry out its mission. But there's a deeper reason for the education of the best programmers. Some people have a natural talent for programming. Typically at the age of 10 to 13, they become fascinated with programming, and if they use a program, they want to know, how does it do this? But when they ask the teacher, how does this program do this? If it's proprietary, the teacher can only say, I'm sorry, it's a secret, we can't find out how it works. And thus education is not permitted. Every program embodies knowledge. If it's proprietary, that's knowledge withheld from the student. It's the enemy of the spirit of education, so it should not be tolerated in the school. The school must demonstrate its loyalty to the spirit of education. But if the program is free, the teacher can explain as much as he knows and then say, here's a copy of the source code, read it and you'll understand everything. And those kids will read it because they're fascinated, they yearn to understand it. And the teacher can say, if you come across any point you can't figure out by yourself, show it to me and we can figure it out together. Now this gives our natural-born programmer the chance to learn a vital lesson. That point in the code is not clear. You shouldn't write code that way. This lesson is very important because this student needs to develop from a natural-born programmer to a good programmer. And the way you do that is you learn to recognize all the ways of writing code that you shouldn't do because they won't be clear to other people. And the way you learn those things is by encountering the problem yourself, reading other people's code. Every time you see code written a certain way and it's hard to understand, you realize, I shouldn't write it this way. This is not good code. How do you learn to write good, clear code? By reading lots of code and writing lots of code. Only free software gives you the chance to read lots of code of large programs we really use. And then you've got to write lots of code, which means writing code in large programs. But how do you learn how to write code in a large program? You have to start small. starting slow in this means writing small changes in existing large programs. Only free software gives you the chance to write changes in existing large programs we really use. First small changes, then bigger changes. And eventually you'll get to the point where you could write a large program from zero. So every school can offer students a chance to perfect the skill, but only if it's a free software school. But there's an even deeper reason for moral education, education and citizenship. The school must do more than just teach facts and skills. It has to teach the spirit of goodwill, the habit of helping other people. So, every class must have the following rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share copies with the rest of the class, including the source code in case someone here wants to learn, because this class is a place where we share our knowledge. Thus, it's not permitted to bring a non-free program to class. The school, to set a good example, must follow its own rule. It must bring only free software to class and share copies with everyone in the class, including the source code. This university, like every school, must move to free software. If you have a relationship with a school, whether you're a student or a teacher or an employee or a parent, it's your responsibility to campaign and pressure for the school to get rid of proprietary software. To do this effectively, you've got to be willing from time to time to make a sacrifice, like saying, teacher, I can't use that program, it's non-free, my conscience won't let me. Please let me use this other free program instead. It will take me extra work, but that's okay. For my conscience, I'll do extra work. It's hard for a teacher to refuse a student who says, please let me do this the harder way and learn more for the sake of my conscience. But some will refuse, and then you have to say, well, I guess I can't take this class this year. I'll try again next year. And if a school tries to give your child a computer with non-free software to take home, you've got to say, no, that computer's not allowed in my house. If the school asks you to sign something promising that your child won't share, say, I believe sharing is good and I won't sign this. You have to. So, the next threats to our freedom in digital society come from internet services. I've already explained how many websites do surveillance, and they get a lot more information about you than you might think, and give it to a lot more companies than you might think. But I already talked about that. Now I'm talking about two other threats. The site can abuse your data, and it can take control of your computing. Now, when I say your data, I'm sure they get lots of data through surveillance, but they also ask the user for data, sometimes with good reason. You know, if the service is supposed to do things with some data, you have to give it the data. But what is the site going to do with that data afterwards? Well, people are becoming quite aware that the site is likely to give it to other companies or let other companies use it somehow and give it to Big Brother, and might even leak it accidentally. Is quite common. This is a threat to your freedom too, and you shouldn't give so much data to any company. You need to save it yourself. Now, it's very important to make backups. You should make your own backups. You can also use remote network backup services, but if so, you should encrypt the data yourself in your own computer with a free program and only send them the encrypted data. That way, they can't understand it. They can do their job and save it for you, but they can't hurt you. The worst thing they can do is lose the data, which of course is always a possibility of happening by accident. And that's why you have other kinds. But the other danger is much less recognized. It's the danger of losing control of your own computing. The same danger that proprietary software carries. Except, in this case, I'm talking about a software substitute as a service. It's a service, an internet service that does the job you could have done by running a program if you have the right program. And if the program is free, then you have control over the computing you're doing. If you use a proprietary program, then you have the program in your computer, but you don't control it. If you use software substitute as a service, you don't even have the program in your own computer. The program is running in somebody else's computer, where of course you can't see or touch it. And that means you don't control how your own computing is done. So you should never use SAS. But actually, SAS is even worse than that. I explained how many proprietary programs have surveillance functionalities that send data about what you're doing to some server. Well, with SAS, the user has to send all the pertinent data to operate on to somebody else's server. So it's the same result. Some server has that user's data, and who knows what it's going to do with it. But it's even worse. As I explained, some proprietary programs have universal backdoors, which allow somebody to remotely change how the user's computing gets done. These include Microsoft Windows, Google Chrome, which is a proprietary browser, and most portable phones. But with software substitute as a service, the operator of the server, of course, can install different or additional software in that server at any time, and this changes how the user's own computing is done without asking permission. So SAS is inherently equivalent to running a non-free program with a surveillance functionality and a universal backdoor. For your freedom's sake, don't use SAS. Fortunately, SAS is a tiny fraction of all the world's websites. If we look at all the world's websites, most of them just present information you could look at. Now, looking at the information somebody else presents is not doing your own computing. It's not something you would expect to have control over. It's kind of communication with them. But if we look at the sites that provide a non-trivial service, most of the time that service is communication with other people, which again is not your own computing, it's a joint activity, not something that you would expect to always have full control over. And why should you? It's not entirely yours. But there are, and so these don't raise the SAS issue either, but there are some services that do computing that's just yours, that you could do with in your own computer with your own copy of a free program. Those are your own computing, and you deserve to have control over those. And anyone who tries to lure you into doing those things through SAS is hurting you, trying to move society in the wrong direction. So those are the things you should refuse to use. The next threat to our freedom in a digital society comes from computerized voting. Elections are a special case activity because you can't tell if somebody else does wrong. Now, in other joint activities, for instance, like e-commerce, well, you're trusting a merchant if you give your credit card, but then you'll find out if the merchant cheats you. And that means you have some basis to expect the merchant not to cheat you. You have some recourse. But there's no way you can check whether your vote was counted correctly. There's no way you can check whether there were false votes put into the totals. So traditionally, the election system was designed so that everyone involved was being monitored by others, except for the voter actually choosing, who was supposed to have privacy. But everyone else who works in the polling place, they're all supposed to check each other so that it's not easy for any of them to commit fraud. And these systems are designed such that people of normal intelligence can understand how they're supposed to work and can understand how fraud would look, so that they can serve in the voting system and help implement it honestly. But once there's a computer program involved, only certain experts can possibly tell if it's honest. And even if though you have some experts check, that doesn't necessarily tell you anything. Suppose the experts say, we studied the source code of this program and it seems to be correct and honest. How do you know that that's the same program that's running in the voting machine when you vote? Maybe somebody changed it that morning and is going to put back the official program that evening. And in the meantime, it's counting some fraction of the votes wrong. There is some evidence that elections in the US were stolen this way. That is through computerized voting machines. So you just can't trust them. Now, using a computer to count paper ballots can be trusted if a hand recount is a real option. And often there are restrictions and obstacles so that it's theoretically an option, but really it's not. But the worst things are the machines where people push the buttons and all that comes out at the end is a total, and there's no way to verify that that total is honest. This is an invitation to hidden, uncheckable fraud. In addition, these machines generally emit signals, and those signals can be monitored from a distance, like outside the polling place. And if it's clear what order people are voting in, who's voting right now, then they can tell from outside the polling place how you're voting. That's not good either, because what if that guy is threatening you unless you vote a certain way? The really stupid thing is, the stupidest thing is internet voting. Because if the voter is using a zombie machine, the botnet will decide how he really votes. And not only that, what happens if somebody's boss says, I want you to vote from the computer in my office, and I'm going to watch you. And that way I'll make sure you voted for the candidate I told you to vote for. Very, very dangerous. But you can't expect to find this illustrates, you can't expect to find all the flaws in some computerized voting system by looking at the software, because the software is used as part of a social system, and the problems can show up in other parts of that social system. Here's an example of a fraud that occurred in the last US election. In some places they were using voting machines where after the user said done, then a few seconds later a screen showed up saying, it looks like you voted for these people. Is that right? Confirm. But most of the time, the voter had already left and didn't see that. So somebody else walked in and said no and changed the votes. Somebody who was working in the polling place. You see, the problems may not be obvious. The only way to find out about them is the hard way. And I don't know if you want your elections to be the guinea pig for that. The next threat to our freedom in digital society comes from the war on sharing, a decades-long attack by publishers against the rights of computer users. You see, digital technology serves humanity because it facilitates copying, manipulating, and transmitting information. But those companies don't want us to be able to copy, transmit, and manipulate information. They want to restrict what we can do with our computers, and they will stop at nothing. First, they tried propaganda. They tried telling people, if you share, you're a pirate. That's ridiculous. Pirates attack ships, which is really big. And sharing is good. So we shouldn't call sharing and attacking ships by the same word. So whenever anyone asks me what I think of piracy, I say attacking ships is very bad. That is, I pointedly reject their propaganda meaning for the word. They also call sharing theft and counterfeiting and any nasty thing you might imagine. They'll say sharing is that. But if they had only used propaganda, it wouldn't be a war. They have a right to state their views after all. But they went much further than that. Decades ago, they began perverting our technology into our enemy. Instead of our servant, it's our prison guard. Because they put in digital handcuffs. The public saw this for the first time in DVDs, which were designed so that the video could be encrypted to restrict the user. This is a malicious functionality. It has no other purpose than to be malicious. And it was successful for a while, but then some people figured out the secret format and released a free program that could decrypt it. So then they started buying laws to censor such software, to ban it. They started in the US, but then they extended it to the European Union and various other countries because servile governments that obey business and are against the people, like the US and to some extent the European Union, pressure other countries to attack their own people in the same way. But that's not all they did. Then they began suing thousands of teenagers for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then they began trying to attack peer-to-peer sharing networks technically and legally. For instance, several countries now have laws that punish people with disconnection from the internet or other attacks on their internet connections for the mere accusation that they have shared. Punishment on accusation, abolishing a fundamental principle of justice. No punishment without a fair trial. But those media companies, they don't care about principles of justice. They're happy to get rid of those to achieve their aims. And shutting down websites, again, without trial, that's another method that you're using in the war on sharing. If you have a personal tracking and surveillance device, please switch it off. It might continue functioning as a listening device even when it appears to be off, but at least it won't make a noise. And recently they've gone even further. In Japan, downloading an unauthorized copy of something from the net is punished with 2 years imprisonment. And if that's not enough to get people to stop sharing, I suppose they'll start executing people who share. Because really, they have no scruples, they have no conscience, they'll do anything to crush whatever isn't under their power. So we have to defeat them. Those companies deserve a certain reward. They deserve to cease to exist. They deserve the corporate death penalty. Now, the death penalty for living beings is barbaric, but those corporations are not people. They only deserve to be tolerated in society if they don't attack people. So think of them as the companies that lobbied for these unjust laws, that turned our governments against us, that sued thousands of teenagers for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And ask yourself what they deserve. They deserve to be rendered unable to hurt us anymore. But when they do this, they always say they're doing it for the artists. Now, this is not a half-truth. It's a 5% truth or something like that. A few artists who are stars gain handsomely, and all the rest are being crushed into the ground under the publishers. It's ridiculous to try to support artists by attacking the people to prop up a system that's so bad at supporting artists. Let's support artists in a better way. I propose 2 methods. One is the state could use some tax funds to support artists. The idea is to distribute the money directly to artists based on the popularity of each one. You can measure the popularity through a system of sampling or polling, surveying, because of course it shouldn't be done with a system of surveillance of everybody. That would be evil in another way. Once you've got a popularity measurement for each artist, how much money does that artist get? The obvious answer is divide the money in linear proportion to popularity. But that's inefficient use of our funds. The reason is that stars can be much, much more popular than other good and appreciated artists. Like a star A could be 1,000 times as popular as capable, successful artist B. And with linear proportion, A would get 1,000 times as much money as B, which means in order for B to get enough for the necessities of life, we'd have to make A tremendously rich. This would mainly turn out to be another way to enrich the rich, which is stupid. So I propose take the cube root of the popularity of each artist and then distribute the money in proportion to the cube roots. The cube root of 1,000 is 10. So if A is 1,000 times as popular as B, this way A would get 10 times as much as B. Not 1,000 times, just 10. Which means the cube root effectively transfers most of the money from the stars to the artists of medium range popularity, the ones who really need more support. This makes the system effective for supporting the arts better. Now, it will still be the case with the cube root that the more popular you are, the more of a share you get. And it will still be the case that the people nobody listens to get nothing. The other system I propose is based on voluntary payments, not micropayments. These are not that small. I'm thinking of, well, maybe $1 one zloty is a good payment that you could send if you wish. There's a button on the player, and you push it, and it sends 1 zloty. And you push it if you like. And if you don't want to, you don't. No, you're not punished, you're not pressured, or insulted, or anything if you don't. But if you do, you'll feel good. And that's why people will do it. Because they'll feel good knowing that they gave some money to an artist whose work they appreciated. Now, this is already happening. There are artists who get their income from voluntary payments. But they have to be bigger payments, because the existing systems don't work for such small amounts. Also, the existing systems are unjust because they're not anonymous. These payments should be sent anonymously. Now, they don't have to be anonymous to the artist receiving the money. That could be recorded to charge them their taxes, for instance. But the crucial thing is to be anonymous for the fans who are sending the money. So every country would choose the amount of money to maximize the total amount people send per unit time. If the amount is too small, lots of people would send, but it would add up to too little. If the amount is too big, people would hesitate to send it. So that I'm guessing that 1 zloty is probably going to reach more or less right to maximize the total in Poland. I think most of you could send 1 zloty every day, and you wouldn't miss the money that you would be spending. But there are some people who can't afford that. There are poor people, and they won't ever send it, and that's okay. We don't need to squeeze money out of poor people or deny them access to art. There are enough non-poor people who will be happy to support artists, and the poor can be welcome to get the benefit and not pay. So with these systems, and by the way, there are many ways to work to put together parts of one and parts of the other with various variations. But what all these systems have in common is sharing that becomes good for the artists. So, and this is in addition to all the things people do now, like sell copies, sell tickets, and so on. I'm not proposing to ban those activities. I don't see anything harmful in them. But I am proposing to legalize sharing, including peer-to-peer sharing on the net. The last thread I want to talk about is the fact that what you do in cyberspace, you don't do by right. You do it on sufferance of various companies, as long as they're willing to let you do it. You don't have the right to go to cyberspace and do anything. So if you have certain opinions like these, for instance, and you want to distribute them to people on the street, you can print copies. You can print pieces of paper and walk around the street and hand them out. Now, it's your right to do that. You don't need to convince a company to cooperate or enable you to do it. But if you want to do the same thing in cyberspace, you need the cooperation of an ISP, of a domain name registrar, and a hosting company. And any of those companies could cut off service to you arbitrarily without even going to court. Now, if you want to collect money for the cause, because the activity costs some money, well, on the street you can carry a can and invite people to put coins and bills into the can. You don't need a company to help you do that. But on the internet, normally you need a payment company in order to receive the money, because there isn't any cash, really. But there is Bitcoin. You can get Bitcoins from people without going through a payment company. But to convert the Bitcoins into money you can spend in most places, you need to go through a company. This is not a good thing. It means that we don't really have rights in cyberspace. We have to change it. We have to legislate that these vital services can't cut you off unless they go to court and prove there's a valid reason, like you didn't pay, or you connected something to the network cable that put in bad voltages and was hurting the equipment. There are some legitimate reasons to disconnect people, but they should have to prove that there's a legitimate reason. Now, the way we learned how bad a problem this was when the United States government decided to try to kick WikiLeaks off the net. WikiLeaks did the heroic job of exposing gruesome crimes by the US government. So there was no legal basis to stop WikiLeaks from publishing such things. So the US government looked for an extra legal way of squashing it. WikiLeaks had rented an Amazon virtual server to distribute things. Well, a US official went to Amazon and said, "You're going to regret it if you don't cut them off." So Amazon cut them off and said, "In some way we don't have to precisely explain, we think you're violating our terms of service, so you're gone." Then they attacked domain names that WikiLeaks used. And then they attacked the payment companies through which volunteers were sending their donations to WikiLeaks. And this proved how vulnerable any internet activity is to this distributed denial of service attack. Now, as a joke, of course, I'm not talking about the usual meaning of that term, which is really a form of internet protest. That's a normal part of democracy, where people send a lot of requests to some website, and the website may not be able to say this is democracy. Of course, the governments that are against democracy will take any excuse to criminalize democratic activity, so they call it a cyber attack, and they try to imprison people for doing it. That just proves, again, how evil they are. But this was a distributed attack against the services that WikiLeaks was using. So this really merits the term distributed denial of service attack. So we've got to give people the right to actually do things in cyberspace. Imagine if you couldn't get out the front door of your building without the services of some company that could cut you off and leave you trapped in your building. That's how it is in cyberspace. I still have some hope that cyberspace may become a place where people have freedom. But we have a big fight on our hands because it's going in the wrong direction. The internet is developing into a scheme that just lures people into giving information about everything in their lives to companies that will use it to exploit them and help a non-democratic government stay in power. So if you want more information about the GNU operating system and free software, look at gnu.org. And if you can also look at fsf.org, which is the site of the Free Software Foundation. You can buy things, you can participate in our political campaigning activities, you could become a member. You could also become a member right here if you want to pay your annual dues in cash. There's also the Free Software Foundation Europe, whose site is fsfe.org. And and you can join that also. Please, if you appreciate our cause, work for it. We need your help to win. Now, since I unfortunately do not have an adorable little GNU to auction, I have to go straight to the questions. What a shame. When you ask me a question, please come up here and make a queue. You will keep the microphone here, and people can line up to ask questions. That method is more efficient, and it's also more fair, because once you're in the queue, you will get your turn in order. Now, I am hard of hearing. So for me to hear your question, you need to say it loud and slowly, and pronounce each consonant carefully the way I'm speaking now.
Yes, please. And let me ask the first question, which is more philosophical, perhaps. Are we born with our freedoms and we are stripped of them by some entities, or we are born without anything and we have to create an area of freedom?
I don't think that there is a general answer to that, and I'm not completely sure what it means. It seems like a mixture of two different questions, one of which is factual and one of which is abstract and may not relate to factual things at all. So it's not a clear question.
Perhaps we'll discuss this later.
Okay, so you said that SaaS is bad. And do you consider Kims.com Mega as a SaaS? Or do you consider all SaaS
No,
as bad?
no, it's not SaaS. It's a communication service. It has a grave flaw. It requires people to run non-free software, namely non-free JavaScript programs that are sent by the site itself. I forgot to mention this. Nowadays, another problem of many websites is that you can't use them without non-free software.
So do you consider SaaS, which could be a free software because of the competition that could...
No, this is incoherent, I'm sorry. Basically, SaaS is software substitute as a service. It means that there's a computing task you want to do, which is your own computing. And you could do it in your own computer by running your own copy of a free program if you have one. But somebody invites you to do it in a different way, which is to send all the data to his server, and then programs chosen by him will do your computing, and then he'll send you the result, or else he'll take action directly on your behalf.
What if you could check the work that he done with some algorithm or...
Well, the thing is, it's not enough just to be able to check it, you should be able to change it. But clearly, it's... Please listen to me. I'm answering part of your question, and you're not letting me answer it. The point is that you deserve to have control over your own computing, which means decide to run a different version of that program if you wish. Now, we can't... If the server is his, he's entitled to control what's in that server. And besides, if he said that every user can change the software on his server, well, different users might want different changes. They might disagree, and they would fight about which way to make that software run. Obviously, that's ridiculous. We can't expect him to let all the users change the software in his computer. But if the users are doing their own computing in his computer, the users don't control it, and he does. So you've got to say no to doing it that way. Now, if those programs are non-free software, then even he can't change them, which is bad for him, but that doesn't help the users. But if they are free software, that means he can change them, which is how it should be, but that doesn't help the users. The users are screwed either way.
So this won't really be a question, but rather an invitation for you to comment on your opinion on the latest draft by W3C to bring DRM to the browsers, the WebKit, I guess.
It's a horrible idea. Now, I should explain why. the companies that want to impose DRM on users, they don't need the support of the W3C. They already do it. They already release add-ons such as Flash that have DRM and other clients that have DRM. There are programs in JavaScript that implement DRM, and they load into a browser and they run and they mistreat the user. So they already can implement DRM. How does it make a difference what the W3C decides? The W3 must not legitimize DRM and must not help DRM become more efficient or convenient in any way. Because what's wrong with DRM is not that it's inconvenient, it's that it's unjust.
In your speech, you mentioned Bitcoin. And
Sorry, I mentioned what?
You mentioned Bitcoin.
Oh yeah.
And I want to ask you, aren't you afraid of a system that isn't controlled by everybody as in free software systems, but is controlled by nobody, so that an individual with a lot of money can make a lot of confusion on the market and
Well, I don't know if that's particularly true. I don't follow it. And as far as I know, although Bitcoin is not directly controlled by any sort of entity, it works in a way that is predictable and understandable. So, I mean, that can be used like cash for transactions that further activities that are harmful, like, killing tigers and elephants. But I don't think that's enough to say that we shouldn't have cash.
I have a question related to GPL license. So I'm a computer programmer, and what happens if I would like to use a GPL licensed library in a software which is run on the server, which is essentially a service?
Okay, well that's okay, but basically the ordinary GPL doesn't have any requirements about what you should do in a case like that. Now the Affero GPL says you would have to make the source code of your version available to those who have access to use your service.
Okay, thanks. So that's clear.
Got a question. For example, if we run free software, for example, GNU, on a hardware that can do something with our data. For example, GNU is free, but hardware can some
You're talking about malicious hardware with a surveillance feature.
Yes.
Well, it's still bad. Basically, free software isn't magic. A free program is under the control of its users, and the users can make it not be malicious. But this doesn't magically fix the hardware not to be malicious. In many cases, malicious hardware needs to be actuated by the software. So if you got free software that could run it, then the hardware's nasty features would be deactivated and you'd be safe. But whether that's true depends on the specifics.
I have a more technical question. I can, for example, opt not to use DRM-protected formats or proprietary software, but what about HTTP? It's hard not to use HDMI right now, but it's even harder to use it without HTTP. What can we do to fight it?
Get other hardware is the only way. Until people find ways of defeating that encryption, that's the only, well, basically there are two things. First of all, if I understand right, HDMI is just the kind of bus, and HTTP is the encryption that's a DRM system Well, if you're running a free operating system, it won't use HTTP. It'll never turn it on.
Yes, but the problem is the other end won't send the data.
Sorry, you don't understand. Or I don't understand. HDMI is between a computer and a monitor, right?
For example, yes.
So the computer is what sends. And if the computer is running a free system, it will never turn on the encryption for what it sends. So the monitor, well, the monitor would be ready to handle the encrypted data, but it won't get any. So HTTP will not be used.
In this case, yes, but for example, HDMI can be between a set-top box and the TV. And this way, the set-top box isn't mine, I don't control it, and it will refuse to send the data to the TV.
Yeah, well, I guess maybe you shouldn't, I don't think I would have a cable box like that. Because I don't want to use DRM. Now, if you're feeding, if you're just feeding the cable signal into a television that's not a computer, and by not a computer, I don't mean there are no processor chips in it. I mean it's not a platform to install software, and it just shows the video. Maybe you can ignore that. But something like the recorders, which are the computers with with software that gets updated, I mean, those are clearly unacceptable. So you have to say no to them.
Would you consider service run on HPL software?
I can't hear the sounds.
Would you consider a service run on HPL software?
On what software?
Afero GPL under
AGPL, that's
yes.
Yeah.
As bad as other SaaS.
Well, yes, these are totally separate issues. SAS is bad even if you have a copy of all the programs running in the server. And here's why. And they're all free. Because you can control your copy, but you can't control the copy running in the server.
Wouldn't that be a breach of a list?
No. You see, there are many kinds of network services which are not SAS. And so, mostly in the free world, when we develop software for servers, and we have lots of free software for servers, well, we are developing them because we want them to be used in things that are not SAS. And that's a perfectly good reason to have them. They're useful for good things, which are not SAS. But though, if you use those same programs to implement SAS, then it's mistreating the user. And the fact that those programs are free doesn't fix it. So no, the AGPL can't fix the SAS problem, but those programs are useful in lots of legitimate cases. And that's where the AGPL is of some help. The purpose of the AGPL is to make sure that the improvements made by some users, which they then put into use on their publicly accessible services, become available to the community of developers of that program.
Sir, in your speech and throughout your life, you have emphasized the importance of freedom or free software as opposed to open source software or proprietary software, to understand this is all you're saying. And it is quite obvious when you talk about computers or smartphones.
Actually, may I interrupt for a moment to clarify one point? Proprietary software is an injustice. As for open source software, almost all of that's free software, so it's good. Or at least it's not bad on these grounds. I'm not going to say a program is bad just because somebody calls it open source. It's probably free software. So the point is the distinction between open source and the term quote open source and quote free software quote is they express different ideas. That's a philosophical political disagreement. Whereas the difference between proprietary software and free software, that's a distinction of substance. That's a matter of acts, which are just or unjust. So it's not three different things that are a parallel distinction. No, it's two different kinds of distinctions.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sorry for being too quick in my opinion.
Well, that's your question.
Yeah, sure. What I was trying to ask you is about, it's quite obvious for what software means in terms of computers and phones, but in today's world, software or electronics plays an important role in our everyday life, not only when you sit in front of a desktop.
Can you give an example so I know what you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm trying to ask you, home appliances or other electronic stuff.
Okay, first of all, okay. A computer is something that you install software on. It's something that has the ability to be programmed. Now, many appliances have a processor inside. If they are not meant for software to be installed in, then they're not computers. And you can't actually tell from using them whether they have a processor inside or a gate array or a special purpose chip, and so it doesn't matter. So those are not computers. The issue of free software doesn't relate to them. Now, other issues do. They could be designed to be malicious. Some of them are. Whether the malicious functionality is a program running on a processor, or a program in a gate array, or built into a special purpose chip, it doesn't actually matter. It's the appliance is malicious. Well, you can think about that issue, but you don't need the concept of free software to think about it. So, meanwhile, if the appliance is not malicious, the fact that it was built with a processor makes no difference in that case either. It's okay. So the issue of free software versus proprietary software arises when the device becomes programmable. In other words, when it's a computer. Now, exactly where to draw the line, well, there's a somewhat of a gray area. There are things which have processors in them, and there are people who have found ways to install some software into them, but that's not part of normal use of the device. So that's where the gray area is, and I think the best place to draw that line is, does normal use of the device include installation of software? Now, another relevant point is, if an upgrade is sent to you, that's installation of software. But the mere theoretical possibility of an upgrade perhaps doesn't count if it isn't used in practice.
Can you comment Microsoft secure boot?
Oh, well, actually, secure boot is not Microsoft's thing. Secure boot is a feature of the latest generation of PCs, where they can have certain signature keys recorded, and they will refuse to run a program unless it has a signature that checks with one of those keys. Well, as long as it's up to the user to control which keys are involved, and the user can sign programs and run them, that's a security feature. But Microsoft wants to convert it into a restriction feature. So we distinguish between secure boot and restricted boot. And the FSF has a campaign against Microsoft's restricted boot. We say, take your restricted boot off our neck. So go to fsf.org and support the campaign.
It is sometimes said that the lack of games holds gnu+linux back. Is the porting of old Steam to gnu+linux a good development or a bad development?
Look at gnu.org/philosophy/non-free-games.html for my thoughts on that topic.
Don't you consider, for example...
I can't quite hear your consonants.
Okay. could you consider a Bitcoin network as a distributed free SaaS?
No. That's wrong. If you look at the definition of software substitute as a service, it means a service that offers to do for you something that's your own personal computing that you can do for yourself. Now, Bitcoin, like all commerce, is a joint activity. I pay him. Well, that's a joint activity between him and me. It's not my personal activity, and it's not his personal activity. And when Bitcoin is used, of course, people do it on their various computers. So it's not SaaS for two different reasons. Yeah, exactly. That's the point. I'm trying to clarify the definition.
Okay, last question.
You're talking only about freedoms. In normal lives, we give our freedoms away, for example, in democracy. What do you think, in your opinion, we shall be denied in the internet?
Denied what?
Denied freedom.
I don't understand.
What shall we denied of in the internet, in our activities on the cyber world?
Well, there are still some ways to use the internet in freedom, but most use of the internet is oppressing people in one way or another. So things are going bad, and they've gone pretty far in that direction.
Okay, so let's thank our guest.
Support the Free Software Foundation, you can give a donation, or you can buy something, or you can join and become a member.